U.S. History STAAR Review with Ms. Lalshi. Westward Expansion. The American Frontier. Colonists began moving towards the Appalachian Mountains and away from the Atlantic before the American Revolution. As the U.S. acquired more territory, settlers began to move westward beyond the Appalachian Mountains. Manifest Destiny. This is the belief that the U.S. would expand to encompass all of the land between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Texas. Texas joined the U.S. in 1845 and became the 28th state. Mexican Cession of 1848. After the Mexican-American War, Mexico sold land to the U.S. for $15 million. The U.S. gained land that helped to form parts or all of California, Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, Wyoming, Utah, and Colorado. Utah Territory. In 1850, Utah became a U.S. territory. GADSDEN Purchase. The U.S. purchased land that is now located in parts of Arizona and New Mexico. The land was used to build a southern transcontinental railroad through El Paso. The California Gold Rush. The California Gold Rush lasted from 1848 to 1849. The majority of gold prospectors never struck it rich. Yukon Gold Rush. In 1896, gold was discovered near the Klondike River in Canada. This region was very close to Alaska. This was one of the most frenzied gold rushes in U.S. history. The journey was very difficult and many just gave up along the way. Other gold discoveries. Gold was also discovered in the Black Hills and the Rocky Mountains. Boomtowns. These were towns that popped up quickly around areas where precious metals and minerals were being mined. They often became deserted just as quickly as they sprung up after the minerals were gone. The Great Plains. This is the region between the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains. It mostly consists of grasslands. The Great Plains was the home to millions of Native Americans and buffalo. The Indian Wars. These were a series of armed conflicts between Native Americans and the U.S. Army. Several tribes were moved onto reservations located in the Great Plains. Battle of Little Bighorn. The Sioux Indians lived in the Black Hills of North Dakota. After gold was discovered there in 1875, they were asked to leave. The Sioux fought the U.S. Army at the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876. They were led by Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. General George Custer and his men were defeated. Custer, along with 264 of his soldiers, were killed. The Sioux following Little Bighorn. The Sioux were forced onto a reservation within 2 years of the Battle of Little Bighorn. Crazy Horse was also killed. Massacre at Wounded Knee. The Sioux were restless living on the reservation. 300 Sioux who were unarmed were gunned down by machine guns in 1890. Men, women, and children were killed in the massacre at Wounded Knee. The Transcontinental Railroad. In 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad was completed. New York City and San Francisco were now connected by a railroad. Previously, the journey would have taken 6 months. After the Transcontinental Railroad was completed, the trip was reduced to only 10 days. Settlers were now able to move westward more easily. Farmers on the Great Plains were also able to ship their crops greater distances. The buffalo. Native Americans relied on the buffalo for food, tools, and shelter. Railroads went through territories where the Native Americans lived. Sharpshooters would kill buffalo from moving trains. The U.S. government encouraged the decimation of the buffalo in an attempt to remove a vital food source of Native Americans. Millions of buffalo were killed in the 1800s. By 1880, there were less than 100 free-roaming buffalo left. Indian removal. During the 1800s, the U.S. government pushed and removed Native Americans off of their land. They were placed on government reservations. The Trail of Tears. Congress ordered all Native Americans living east of the Mississippi to leave their homes. They were forced to walk thousands of miles with no shelter and little food or water. Thousands died on the journey. Those who survived the journey resettled west of the Mississippi. Reservations. These were areas that land had been set aside for the resettlement of Native Americans who accepted the U.S. government's authority. The land was almost always smaller than what they were used to. In addition, the land was usually very poor. The U.S. government tried to turn them into farmers when they were traditionally hunters. The DAWES Act of 1887. Reformers wanted Native Americans to adopt the American culture or Americanize so that they could be more like other Americans. The U.S. government abolished all tribes and divided up the reservations. Each family was given 160 acres of property to farm. Native Americans who agreed to follow this plan were promised American citizenship and the right to vote. The U.S. government took 2/3 of the reservation lands and sold it to white settlers. The DAWES Act almost completely destroyed what was left of Native American culture. The American Indian Citizenship Act. Most Native Americans had not been granted U.S. citizenship and were prevented from obtaining it like foreign immigrants were able to. The American Indian Citizenship Act was passed by Congress in 1924. This act granted American citizenship to all Native Americans who were born in the U.S. The Homestead Act of 1862. This act provided 160 acres of land to families who would settle in the West. They were required to live on the land for 5 years and make improvements to the land, such as farming. Windmills. These were used to tap into water that was underground. The water was then used to irrigate dry farmland. Steel plow. Farmers used this to break up the soil and plant crops. They were able to tear up the ground and plant seeds quicker. Cattle drives. Ranchers would drive cattle north through the open ranges. Once they reached the railroad, the cattle were loaded and shipped east. Barbed wire. This was used to close the open ranges and fence off the Great Plains. Farmers on the Great Plains. Many farmers did not rotate their crops, which began to use up minerals in the soil without replacing them. The land was cheap, but many often mortgaged their farms. Farming equipment was expensive, and farmers often went into debt to purchase the required equipment. Farmers struggle. Many were in debt from purchasing equipment. Farms across the nation were mortgaged. Too many crops were being produced, and crop prices dropped. Railroads were charging high rates to ship goods shorter routes. Floods, droughts, insect infestations, and overproduction of the soil wreaked havoc on crops. The Granger movement. Farmers lived isolated lives. The Granger movement began as a social club. By 1877, there were over 1.5 million farmers in the organization. They began to participate in politics for economic and social reforms that would benefit farmers. Munn versus Illinois. The Supreme Court said that it was the right of states to regulate businesses in the interest of the public. Gibbons versus Ogden. The Supreme Court said that Congress had the right to regulate interstate commerce. Interstate Commerce Act. Congress passed this law to regulate interstate commerce. It said that railroads could not charge higher rates to farmers who were shipping goods on shorter routes. The Interstate Commerce Commission was created to enforce this new law. Up next, the Progressive Era.